Someone's in the kitchen with Dinah. Someone's in the kitchen, I know. I almost forgot to make a video this week. I've been working on the railroad. I promised you guys that I'd talk about prototyping, freelancing, and protolancing, explain what the difference was, but let's start with something else, something historically significant, possibly the year that was most historically significant for model railroading. I want to take you back to 1934. In 1934, Model Railroader magazine began publication, selling for 10 cents. For me, this is overshadowed by the fact that John and Andrew, two brothers, went to the World's Fair in Chicago and saw some scaled model trains in operation. John, it was love at first sight. And I'm talking of John Whitby Allen, also known as the Wizard of Monterey. It could be argued that he was one individual who changed the landscape, pardon the pun, of model railroading more than anyone else has. He was a photographer, independently wealthy by 1946. At this point, he sold his business and went full-time into model railroading. Supplies were scarce in 46, so he did a lot of scratch building. He also studied and watched railroad operations and studied how the equipment itself was built. But for me, it was all about Emma. Emma, Engine 13, was a Stegosaurus figurine he used in photographing model railroad equipment for advertisers. Some of the other things he did for giggles include, but are not limited to, pulling two articulated club locomotives backwards with one of his tiny locomotives that he had modified to handle 14-inch radii. He built a water feature with real water in such a way that it took 15 minutes to get from where you added the water to where it exited. He created so many scenes that required no caption. I'd just laugh out loud at the sight of them and see what story they told. Sometimes this was to my embarrassment. He created scenery so majestic that it made me wish that I was there. And yes, John did all of that and more. He did a lot more. He built 2.5 versions of the Gorre Daphetid, not to be confused with 2.5 Men. The original layout was just 6 foot 8 inches by 3 foot 7 inches and had 14-inch radii curves in HO scale, or as I like to call it, borderline insanity or genius. Either way, the original layout appeared in both of his layout expansions with very minimal changes each time, and being a photographer, his layouts were well documented. My favorite photo is 3 men, including John, sitting shoulder to shoulder, all operating the original layout, which was not in the photo. All things must end, and sadly, so it was that on January 6th of 1973, the Wizard of Monterey suffered his second, and this time fatal, heart attack. 10 days later, fellow model railroaders' friends came over to see how they could preserve the unfinished model. No small task given Allen's use of mirrors. No one could ever find all the ones that he had put in. John liked to keep the basement cool, so one of the fellows fired up the basement furnace. An investigator determined that the fire, which was mostly confined to the layout room, was caused by a small gas furnace, according to Lynn H. Westcott. John's brother Andrew asked Lynn if he could look into the possibility of saving the layout. After 2 hours of work stabilizing things, and Lynn literally wrote the book on bench work, so they couldn't have had a better person making this attempt. The French Gulf section was destroyed as they attempted to move it, the layout, a complete loss. But John's legacy lives on. He passed away when I was fresh out of diapers, but my love of switching puzzles comes from his time saver puzzle. And don't you dare build that thing on your layout, or you will rue the day. My appreciation of scenery and lighting? John. quirky railroad humor. Again, John, but I tend to be a lot tamer with mine, on the layout at least. The use of mirrors to expand a space. I need to learn that one, but it's because of him I'm interested, and I don't know that anybody had attempted it before. Forced perspective. He got me in that enough that I've been looking into things that he didn't do. But I wouldn't have bothered if not for him. Track planning? John Allen and his friend Lynn Westcott got me started down that rabbit hole. I met him and his layout in the early 80s, after he had passed. I'd already been introduced to model railroading, but he showed me, long after he was gone, what model railroading could be, and how combining a fertile imagination with sound railroad operating practices could transform something ordinary into the sublime. There was one thing I found weird at the time. He had freelanced it. He made everything up. And he created the most famous layout in America, possibly the most famous in the world. How had he done that? As I approach 50, I think I'm starting to get it. In any case, rest well, John. And thank you for showing me some of what you did, and for letting me figure out the how. There you are. So now that we've met John Allen, and who I consider to be the most influential person in all of model railroading, let's talk about what is the difference between prototyping, freelancing, and protolancing, and which might be the best fit for you, and what I've decided on for my models. Prototyping is actually where I'd recommend beginners start, but beware of the Rivet counter, and I'll come back to that. Prototyping is just modeling a prototype, a real-life railroad. Now, I grew up in eastern Iowa, so the Rock Island was something that I grew up in. I very graphically remember I'm going bankrupt. My favorite railroad is the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. Southern Pacific and Union Pacific have both come up with some pretty interesting locomotives as well. So what would I model if I was prototyping? Well, I could do the Tehachapi Loop. And the Tehachapi Loop, the Tehachapi Pass is out in Southern California, and it connects the valley through the Tehachapi Mountains to the town of Tehachapi, and thus to the Mojave Desert, which is at a high elevation. Also one of the two places in the world where Joshua trees grow. So it presents some interesting scenery, and there's an interesting history there too, where you're coming down the pass, because the route that was scouted successfully was scouted from the top down, not from the bottom up. And it came from the top down, and it come around this hill away from the mountains and crossed over itself, or ducked under through a tunnel and proceeded on down into the valley. The average grade is 2.2%, and this loop actually did a lot to reduce how steep the grade was. And 2.2 in the US for mainline grade, that's really steep. It really is. So is anything over 2%, don't let anybody tell you different. So how would I model this? Well, I can't model it, actual scale. If I was to do it in N scale, it would be almost 8 foot in diameter, and there's really not enough room in my basement for something like that, let alone the rest of the pass. And if I'm wanting to model the pass, what I have to do is I have to capture the image, I have to capture the spirit, I have to capture the feel of the place, to where when you look at it, it's like, oh yeah, that's Tehachapi. Don't let anybody tell you different. But this means that, like, if you want to model a Chicago classification yard, which Chicago's littered with them, you don't want 3 tracks. but nobody can model the 42 tracks of the yard. You're going to have to find some way of compressing it down to, say a dozen. But if you were to go below a dozen, it wouldn't have that feel. So some of this is still going to take up some room. And we call this selective compression, where you're deciding the things that we can shrink down, shrink sidings in length, turn 4 tracks into 2, and things like that. And this is where I run into problems with the rivet counters. And rivet counters, they will actually sit there and count rivets on a tender. And they'll go, this should have 27 rivets, and it only has 24. Now, if you are scratch building a piece of equipment and you want to make sure that it is exactly right, well, yes, you should count rivets, but you should count your rivets. Unless you ask somebody for their opinion on your locomotive, they should not be coming up to you going, this isn't prototypical. The rivet count is wrong. You got too much space between the cab of the steam engine and the tender, and it's just, you know what? If you follow the rules on electrical safety and you're having fun, you're doing it right. Can't say that often enough. The rivet counters, I'm okay with. The rivet counters that are counting other people's rivets, get away from me, man. And leave the new people alone. You'll drive them out of the hobby. And the only way I know to handle these people appropriately is to yell at the top of your lungs, stop touching me! Because if they're making you uncomfortable, why shouldn't they be? So that's prototyping. Well, let's go to protolancing. Protolancing is kind of a cross between freelancing and prototyping, but you know, it's still reminiscent of the prototype. Take the Tehachapi Loop. You know, you got the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and you got the Southern Pacific. Well, back in I want to say late 80s, early 90s. No, it was early 80s. They attempted to merge, and the ICC blocked them, and so did the courts. So the merger didn't go through. And they had already repainted some of their locomotives in a scheme called Kodachrome. Well, what had happened if that merger had gone through? Well, now we're in an alternate history, and this is where protolancing comes in. You're still following all the practices. You're still doing all the things that the railroads did, but you're doing it the way you think it would have gone had something gone different. Good examples of this, Milwaukee Road. They de-electrified part of their line. Well, actually, they de-electrified all their electrified lines, which were out west. What would have happened if they hadn't done that? What would have happened if they had expanded the electrical lines when the energy crisis in the 70s hit? Maybe they wouldn't have gone bankrupt. What if hauling passengers was actually profitable? And believe it or not, it's never really been profitable here in the States. Not really. The margins are thin when you are making a profit. And it is done for the image of the company, which would help them haul more freight. So what if there was no Amtrak? What if the railroad companies were still hauling? Nothing else in history changed. BNSF, what kind of passenger service would they be providing? Or what if the railroad wars of Raton Pass and Royal Gorge, between the Denver and Rio Grande and the Santa Fe, what if the court had ruled the other way and the Denver and Rio Grande had gained control of Raton Pass and Santa Fe had gained control of Royal Gorge? What would things have looked like from there? Or what if dieselization had never happened? Or anything like that. And you could even go like, what if there were dragons and you made them into steam locomotives? It's an actual tabletop game that was invented all around that one concept. Well, what if that happened in real life? But now, if you want to move those dragons through Mordor, well, now we're completely into freelancing. And this is where John Allen comes in with how to freelance and make a good sell. Because I believe that you really have to sell your railroad. If we're going to sell the railroad, and we're going to sell the railroad, by selling the railroad, I mean, I want people to believe that this is something that could be. Especially when freelancing, for me, this is important. For other people, not so much, but you really need to go into the operating practices. How do you lay out the track work in a realistic manner? You know, how did the real operators do it? John Allen studied that extensively, and he also studied how the cars themselves were built because he scratch built all his stuff. We don't have to go that far, but the more we do it, the more we try to keep it to real world, the easier it is to sell as this is the railroad that could have been, or it never was, or you know, maybe it was proposed. We don't have it. Starting to get a little bit towards protolancing there, but I still firmly believe that's freelancing. And connect these two cities, but really? If we do this, if we take great care with how we're going to do our freelancing and make it just as real as we can, if it's set in a time period, keep it historically accurate. Maybe the occasional anachronism. I'm a Doctor Who fan. If there happens to be a TARDIS on my layout somewhere, well, you know, so be it. This is freelancing, though. So what is right for you? I can't tell you that unless you are building your first layout, in which case I really would suggest you find a prototype to look after, model a little bit, because this will get you familiar with the other concepts that will open up your world later on with the freelancing and the protolancing. Your imagination's the limit. What about my railroad? Well, in the case of the Christmas tree layout, I want to just do a winter theme on that. Completely freelance, representative of nothing, running whatever oddities. It's really more of a joke. But the thing is that 11 months out of the year, that's going to be in my study. And when it's in my study, it becomes a test bed, an experimental thing. I can do up the sceneries real nice and everything. It's not going to be believable. It doesn't have to be believable, though. This is something I experiment with, and then it goes under the Christmas tree, and things get repainted for Santa and stuff. And eventually, as the bigger layout goes in, I'll be putting it away in storage. Okay, so we're good to go with that. We know what's happening there. What about the bigger layout? Thing is, with this bigger layout, I looked at a lot of things. I knew I was doing narrow gauge, so I got the idea, what about running Garrett's in the United States? So obviously I'm thinking about freelancing this, the narrow gauge part at least, from word go. Makes sense to me because I want to do the things that I want to do. I want to do them in a prototypical style, but at the same time it's kind of what if? What if Garrett's were in the US? Okay. Is that protolancing or freelancing? Well, not basing the rest of the railroad on any real company, so freelancing. So I'm really going to have to sell this. I'm going to have to do a lot of things very, very right for that Garrett to look like it belongs. And then I found a double Erie. 2882 plus 2882. It was a patent that was filed in 1928. And it was never built. But if it was patented, I could make it believable that it was built. So it was decided that I have to go no earlier than 28. Well, what am I going to do for a connecting line? This is I do want to interchange between an actual existing railroad and my company, and in Redwood territory, well, there was only 2 companies really, and I found them here, a little 1928 Atlas that I happened to stumble across. And the Northwestern Pacific was called the Redwood Empire. And they ran up to Eureka, which was pretty much the linchpin of the logging industry of Northern California at the time. Okay, well that was easy. I just happened to stumble across it, and I learned that NWP, Northwestern Pacific, also stands for nowhere in particular, which is what they called that railroad. It went nowhere in particular. So what if I did the Northwestern Pacific at a town for an interchange that it's my town, doesn't really exist, and where is it on the line? Well, it's probably up near Eureka, but really it's nowhere in particular. Well, that would be keeping in the spirit of the NWP, but obviously I'm not accurately modeling the NWP in any way, shape, or form. At this point, it doesn't even matter if I'm going to use all the correct equipment with all the correct car numbers and all that. I can prototype that to fairly well, but I'm protolancing. I'm very lightly protolancing, but I'm protolancing because of the town of Fish. And why is the name Fish? Well, the name of the president is Albert Fish, and named the town after him. Named the railroad after him. Okay, well, where's chips come from? Well, what if there's a town off the layout? Like way off the layout. And this town off the layout, it's like a forward logging camp, or it used to be, and it grew up to be a small community. And maybe F&C Timber Company, it wants to become a common carrier. You know, fish and chip specific. Okay, we'll hold off on the common carrier idea, but we'll leave it open. But yeah, chips can be the name of the layover yard, or a staging yard, or the fiddle yard, whatever you choose to call it. And there's a difference. I'll get into those later. Yeah, okay, so we have the narrow gauge layout. It is going to be narrow gauge, and they are going to haul 20, 25 foot diameter tree trunks on it because they're logging redwoods. Mostly smaller than that, but you know, occasionally you're going to have the bigger tree. And you don't want to harvest all the big trees. Even back then they knew, hey, that's a huge tree, leave it alone. So we have a plan. We're going to freelance F&C Timber Company, and we now have a name for it, and by the way, name for this channel. And then we got the NWP, which we're going to Protolance. I want to get the locomotives right. I want to get the cars right-ish. I want to find a timetable from 1928. And why 1928? Well, that Garrett, it has to be after 1928 and 1929. You had the stock market crash, and you had the Santa Fe selling their interest in the Northwestern Pacific back to the Southern Pacific, who had co-founded the railroad with them. Also, Prohibition ended in 28, and I kind of want to catch like the tag end of Prohibition. It sounds like fun. So I have a very, very narrow window that I want to very, very historically accurately model. Whew. But by doing that, I'm going to be able to sell the railroad a lot better. A lot better. And more importantly, I'll have more fun with it. Because after all, you follow the electrical safety rules and you're having fun, you're doing it right. And that works for me. So, got some recommendations for you. You want to follow up on John Allen? I'm going to put a couple of links up there or there. Or, I get confused on this. Up in the corner or down in the description below. Preview those. And then if you find that you want to know more about John Whitby Allen, and he is a guy worth getting to know, there's some a DVD that does some footage from his layout. And there's a John that was written by probably his best friend, Lynn H. Westcott, also a giant in model railroading, at least here in the States. And it's about 144 pages. And it's not an affiliate link. I get nothing from this. But there is a link to it in Amazon in the description below. Check out the videos. The videos here on YouTube. And if he sounds like a character that you want to check out, well, there you go. Check him out. Next week, we're going to go into something that is just deeply personal to me. Probably what I consider the most important thing when you build a model railroad, if you're going to build it as a model and not a toy. What purpose does it serve? Till next time, guys. Adios, amigos. Used in photography. Oh, it's gonna be a fun night. Photography models. Okay. All right. You know what? I'm double checking that I'm recording. And then I've gone about 10 minutes into this thing. And photographing. We can make take a lot of care. Wow. Really just kind of lost my train of thought there. A Stegosaurus figurine he used in photography. Uba chaka, uba, uba, uba chaka, uba, uba. I can't fight this feeling. Especially photographing.
This has been a Fish Chips production.